Good evening, everybody. It's great to see so many people here on what is actually a very nice May evening. Welcome to this event entitled Can Markets Pursue Social Values? This event is being recorded for a podcast, and so for those of you who will be listening subsequently, we're coming to you from quite an auspicious location, the Shaw Library. We're actually sitting in the light of the Fabian window, the famous Fabian window, which says that you should pray devoutly and hammer stoutly. And I think the Fabians would be quite interested in this topic, which is it's a broad and ambitious question we are addressing today. Certainly one I don't think our panelists can answer exhaustively, but we have a quite extraordinary panel of experts here who are going to give us their views on this difficult, thought-provoking question. To give you some context for the event, it's taking place under the umbrella of the Beveridge 2.0 Festival, which has been taking place for the last few months here at the LSE. And the Beveridge 2.0 celebrates the 75th anniversary of the very famous Beveridge Report, written by a director of the LSE, which identified the 5 giants of kind of public policy concern at the time, prefigured the introduction, the development of the welfare state in the United Kingdom. The Beveridge Festival has been revisiting the Beveridge's 5 giants for the 21st century. So looking at, these have been reimagined as poverty, healthcare, education, housing, and work. I suppose in sort of where precisely this event came from was that in the process of planning the Beveridge Festival, it came to the same time as the Prime Minister, Theresa May, gave a very provocative speech to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the independence of the Bank of England, where she gives what is a rousing defense of the values of the free market economy, where she describes the free market economy as, quote, the greatest agent of collective human progress ever created. Not really much nuance there. And so the purpose of this panel is really to think about Beveridge and Beveridgean ideas of collective social progress in the context of, I suppose, 2018, and the big difference between Beveridge 1.0 and Beveridge 2.0 has, of course, been the rise of what, for want of a better term, I think it's a term that's overused and occasionally abused, but the neoliberal thinking. And I suppose the criticism of government failure and the preeminence of market-focused thinking. So really, this panel is trying to open and ask the question, to what extent can markets and market-based public policies for the sorts of collective social concerns first identified in the original Beveridge report and still of pivotal importance today? I'm going to introduce our very distinguished panel. So I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, we have Professor Simon Deakin, professor at the University of Cambridge and director of the Centre for Business Research. He is an expert in innumerable areas of legal research, and he's also very much an interdisciplinary scholar, working in the area of, for example, economic analysis of law, corporate law, labour law, EU law. We then have Professor Julia Black. She is a professor of law here at the Department of Law of the LSE, and she's also pro-director for research here at the LSE, and she is really one of the preeminent scholars in the world of the field of regulation, particularly the area of financial regulation. And third, we'll have Dr. Sean Ennis, who is a senior economist at the competition division of the OECD in Paris. He has also had a very distinguished career in competition enforcement in several governmental agencies. And I guess I would perhaps particularly, he is an expert in innumerable areas of competition policy, but perhaps of greatest interest for this particular panel. He spearheaded the OECD's recent, very, I suppose, groundbreaking work on the link between competition policy and inequality, and to what extent, the extent to which markets can actually be used to solve problems with inequality. So each of the panelists is going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open to the floor for questions. So, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Niamh. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say something, first of all, about Beveridge and his ideas, and then to relate Beveridge's legacy to debates today about labour markets and how social security is organised. Before Beveridge wrote the famous report on social insurance in 1942, he'd already had a very long career of being an activist, a reformer, and a researcher and an academic. Back in the 1900s, in 1909, he'd written a book called Unemployment, A Problem of Industry, and the title of the book says everything about the approach he and the other Fabians took to the analysis of the labour market. Unemployment, according to Beveridge and the Webbs and other Fabians, was not the fault of individuals. It wasn't the fault of individual malfeasance. It wasn't the fault of shirking by work-shy people. It was a feature of industry, of the way in which capitalism was organised, and above all, it was a feature of the way employers operated. Employers hired people in a way that created underemployment, created irregular and casual work. And what in those days was called casual or irregular work, today we call labour market flexibility, and we laud it as an important feature of the way our society works. The downside, of course, with casualisation, to give it its proper name, is that it denies workers a regular income, but often gives employers a cheap pool of labour from which to draw. It wasn't just employers either, it was also the state at that time, in the early 20th century. The state itself perpetuated the conditions for a casual labour market through what was then known as the Poor Law, the predecessor of Social Security law. In many ways, the Poor Law has been misinterpreted. As long ago as the 17th century in this country, there was a poor law, and to be poor and to be in poverty didn't mean lacking resources. It specifically meant being wage dependent, being in wage labour, not having independent means and working for your living, at a point when most people still had access to the extended family or to the land. To be poor was to be dependent on an employer or on the state. But the laws regulating the so-called poor in this country from a very early stage of its industrial development actively supported the emergence of a labour market. There wouldn't have been a labour market and there wouldn't have been an industrial revolution in this country had it not been for the Poor Law, which provided so-called outdoor relief, cash payments to the unemployed and to the elderly and to the sick, organised at parish level in the thousands of parishes which operated after the end of the Tudor period, but under legislation that was national. And that national legislation required local parishes to raise a poor relief through taxation of property at local level and forbade charitable giving because it was deemed to be inefficient. It was more efficient if the state organised social security. Now those ideas faded away in the 19th century to be replaced by the workhouse. And Beveridge and the Webbs were coming to this debate at the end of a period in the 19th century when it gradually became obvious to nearly everybody that the workhouse system wasn't curing unemployment. It wasn't counting unemployment, but it didn't cure unemployment, and it didn't cure poverty. Because poverty in London and other major cities in the early 20th century affected around a third of all households. Now today, we have figures not far away from that, around 25 to 30% of all children in this country are in poverty. So we're going back to those days. What Beveridge and the Webbs saw was that the labour market is not a natural thing. Labour is not a natural commodity, nor is the employment contract. These are institutionally constructed, and the state constructs markets for better or worse. And there are no real markets with sufficient scale to operate except through the nation state. And despite talk of globalization, that remains the case today. In the early 20th century, we didn't have globalization, but we had imperialism, which again, in many ways, was the same thing. The Fabian answer to globalization of the time and to casualization was a complex one. There wasn't a single solution. There wasn't a universal basic income, or something like that, which apparently cured everything. There were instead a series of individual incremental measures like labour exchanges, like social insurance, so workers, the state, and employers together pooled the risks of unemployment, sickness, and old age. There was eventually, in 1942, a national insurance system. The date is significant because at the point when the war was still being fought, anything less than a truly national level system of social insurance was deemed inadequate at affecting the relevant pooling of risks. But the point about social insurance was that it was both an ethical and an efficient principle. Without social insurance, of course, people can't get insurance, but economists will tell us that in most insurance markets, adverse selection means that insurers in the private sector tend to insure the low risks. They insure the wealthy and the rich before they insure the poor. Beveridge's scheme of social insurance was designed to insure everybody through the mechanism of waged employment. Waged employment was the mechanism through which national insurance contributions were collected. Waged employment was the basis upon which one acquired social citizenship in Beveridge's model. The other great report Beveridge wrote about at the same time was a document called Full Employment in a Free Society, published as a political document by the Liberal Party in 1945, but which greatly informed the government's white paper on full employment of 1944. And the wording matters. The Fabians were very good at finding the right word for things. So Beveridge did not refer to a high employment rate as we do today. Full employment did not mean that everybody had just any job. Beveridge was clear that full employment meant sustainable and, we would now say, decent work for everybody. And that was reflected in the minutiae of national insurance legislation. So a worker in Beveridge's scheme could decline an offer of employment if the wage did not meet a benchmark of a decent wage set by collective bargaining, and if it didn't reflect that worker's previous earnings for a certain period of time. So today's 0 hours contracts, which are a form of casualisation of an extreme kind, are of course today triggered in large by the rules of the social security system, including universal credit, which is deliberately designed to force people into low-paid, insecure, part-time and casual work. We accept this today as a society, and virtually all politicians of whatever political party still today laud the high employment rate enjoyed in this country, while accepting, of course, that at the same time there's a huge problem in this country of poverty. The two are connected. One cannot have a full employment rate in which around a third of the population has no access to regular, stable work, and that's growing all the time, and at the same time cure poverty. The answer of fiscal credits, tax credits, to top up wages, which were introduced by a Conservative government in the 1980s and greatly expanded by New Labour, faces its own problems. Because tax credits target wages ultimately onto inefficient employers. That's what the Webbs noticed, that a poor law system which subsidises wages that way is actually really subsidising not the worker but the employer. And it reduces us, at the same time, incentives for productive investment, which is partly why investment in this country is falling, and we have the strange phenomenon of capital shallowing, labour replacing capital. That's the wrong way round, of course. In a capitalist economy, for it to work, labour should be expensive and capital should be cheap. We need to see labour replacing capital investment that will produce more productive firms and more efficient firms, and will eventually also employ more people. This is what the Fabians understood. Now, that message, of course, I'd say appears enormously radical to us today, because we have a group of people who don't accept the premises of flexible labour markets. They didn't accept the premise that shareholders owned firms and were entitled to the highest possible return on their investment. They didn't accept either that capitalism was about to end, as some people now believe. They didn't believe that they were then in late capitalism, and nor should we now. They didn't try to design a utopian plan for a world that wouldn't exist in their lifetimes, but they were concerned with incremental reforms that would improve people's lot. A modest, and these days perhaps a rather unfashionable agenda, because of course these days the big idea, especially if it can be summed up in 3 words like universal basic income, matters more than incremental, hard-won reforms. Now that, of course, we could change. We need to think about markets, I think, very differently. We need to think about both ethics and efficiency at the core of the way markets work. And markets which are not ultimately equitable are not sustainable markets. We need to think about the role of the state in creating conditions for fair and efficient industry and markets. And we need to think about the role of social scientists and what they do, how they present their messages, what kind of message they try to get across. This, I think, would be Beveridge's message to us today, and a message, I think, which has a certain amount of resonance. Thank you.
I'm going to pick up some of the themes from that, taking a similarly historical perspective, but looking at the role of the state in markets coming in a slightly different angle through business and through the regulation, both the constitution of those markets and the regulation of the relationships which exist within them through corporations, through contracts, and through the conduct of the way that business behaves. Again, to go back to, I suppose, to start where we are now and then to go back. So the paradigms that we have now, which are, they're familiar to us now, but they're actually, needless to say, relatively new, that of the neoliberal paradigm, which is that markets are actually quite institution-free, which to a lawyer always jars. And the boundary of the state's intervention in markets stops at whatever is necessary in order to assure the efficiency of those markets. So the question for an economist in this paradigm very easily would be answered, do markets deliver social values? Well, yes, they do, because they allocate resources efficiently through the price mechanism. And what is necessary is in order to ensure that those markets function appropriately so that resources are appropriately allocated, that prices are appropriately set. And in order to do that, certain preconditions need to be in place. You need to have a range of buyers and sellers. You need to have access to full information. You need, very interestingly, to have unbiased predictions as to the future, always a little bit of a challenge. You need to make sure that the price of negative externalities is internalized into the cost of the good which is being produced. And there might be some issues about coordination problems that there may be a role for the state possibly to come in and resolve. If we were to roll back, so therefore from that was born in the 80s the shift of the state out of the nationalizations which had accompanied the reforms that Simon was talking about in the early 1940s. The early 1940s, mid-1940s, post-Second World War saw the wave of nationalizations. The central bank nationalized, railways, coal and steel a little bit later. So you'd have that intervention into the state. The 80s was a shift back away from that into we retreat, lots of slogans, the state goes into rowing, not steering, etc. And we still are absolutely within that paradigm now. So in terms of understanding the role of the state, then it is to regulate, as I say, to correct those market failures, and really not to participate in the market as a market actor. Both are complete fallacies. Okay? The state has always participated in the market as a market actor. And the way that it's participating now, in fact, a core element of the industrial strategy is that the state is to be the entrepreneurial state. There's a wonderful slide by an economist actually at UCL, Mariana Mazzucato, who launched her book here quite recently. She has a slide of the iPhone. Every single technological component of the iPhone was funded by government money, funding research into technology. The internet is another prime example. So the state has never set itself aside from engagement in economic activity, and nor has the state ever confined itself in intervening in the way that markets work and the way that businesses function into the perfection of the market economy. So if I was to roll back from where we are now, going right back through, well, starting off with the Romans, always use the price of bread, always comes up at this point, price of bread being regulated to maintain public order. As you move through shipping, Plimsoll Line has its origins with the Minoans. If you move through the guild system, a state-facilitated system of market-generated quality control, which was authorized, sanctioned, and chartered by the state. If we roll on through the Industrial Revolution, then we see the traces of much of our modern regulatory state, as we're used to thinking about it, actually coming through the inspectorates that came up with industrialization. With industrialization, you had the Factory Acts, you had the Passenger Shipping Acts, some of the very early regulation for passenger safety, actually associated with migration from Ireland actually out to the US. You have a focus, therefore, on regulation not actually about protecting markets or correcting market failure, but about managing risks to health and safety. You have then regulation which comes in post the smogs, needless to say, in the 50s for the Clean Air Acts. So you have, in other words, the pursuit of social values all the way through. Now, some of those things you can recharacterize and have been recharacterized in economic terms as the correction of externalities, as therefore some type of perfection. But there's always been a very strong streak also of ethical regulation. If one was to look at, for example, the ethics of genetic testing, of embryo research, of animal procedures, of regulation of testing on animals. They are very, very strong expressions of a collective, normative set of values of how we should pursue technologies and where the limits of those technologies should come in. There's also a very strong pursuit through state regulation of institutional values. I work in the area of legal services regulation. One of the legislative mandates that we have as a legal services regulator is to uphold the rule of law and protect access to justice. So in terms of the recognition of the role of the state, to say that the role of the state is to be confined and the state has to self-confine itself to this role of protecting markets, it's never been true. The state has always stepped beyond that. And I think what's quite interesting is even in those areas of the economic regulators, as they are termed in terms of those nationalised industries that were then regulated, then yes, there was an initial very pure economic sense that you're there for price control and to manage the monopoly industry, but very quickly became overlaid with social obligations. Universal service obligation, for example, was obviously the first contender, moving in now to protection of vulnerable customers, moving in now to the very interesting question from an economist's point of view about how do you set a fair price. So can markets pursue social values? I've talked so far about governments prompting markets to pursue social values. And one of the reasons, obviously, that the government may need to step in there is because I think markets can't do that on their own. I think one of the questions we then have to think about is, well, in what instances do markets pursue social values? And here I think there's some really interesting examples, partly from self-regulation, but actually more from the transnational regulatory regimes which are non-government based, but also aren't entirely market firm based either, in the sense they're not being run by a profit-making company. And I'm thinking of some of the, for example, the Fair Trade, Forest Stewardship Council always comes up in this context, global RAP, clothing standards in the clothing industry, the number of different stamps you can have for fair trade in coffee, for example. And what you have here, I think, is a really interesting example of actually how markets can be prompted to work to pursue particular social values, but without the intervention of the state or even the support of the state. So what you have, for example, in Forest Stewardship Council, which is always a very good example in this context, is a business-to-consumer, B2C, regulatory regime in the sense that what you are focusing on, however, is the entire supply chain to ensure that the wood, in this case, has been sourced from sustainable forests. Very complex global transnational regulatory regime in terms of its dynamics. It's very democratic in the way that it tries to operate. That gives it some very internal challenges. But there's no role of the state there. The state may then incorporate it, and in fact in some of the UK's legislation around forestry and forest management, some of those standards are incorporated, but it can actually exist without the authority of the state. And many of those global labelling regimes are actually enforced, as I say, through the supply chains and those global supply chains. So yes, markets can, in some circumstances, pursue social values. They tend to be quite specific, issue specific, and they rely, particularly in the business, if they're in retail context, for consumers to actually know, understand and care about the social value that they're trying to pursue. Are governments necessary in order to prompt markets to pursue social values? Yes, they are. Have they always done that over time? Yes, they have. Is it therefore absolutely necessary to think about how we should be perhaps reconfiguring our thinking, not only around how we provide for the to mop up the excesses of capitalism, which is one way that you can describe our social welfare system, but actually a reconfiguration of both, in a word, the regulatory project and the Beveridge project, in a way that means that we can have not two parts of government and in different ways addressing markets, but in a way which makes us rethink the paradigm that we're in at the moment. That's quite a big challenge. I don't quite know how we would go through that. But if we're to try to rethink Beveridge without rethinking the macroeconomic paradigm in which we're currently operating, then we're only going to come up with the same variants of the same solutions that we already have. What we need, I think, is a much more radical transformation in our thinking around both. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to follow up with some more specific comments. And I'll just start by saying it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and that what I'm saying does not necessarily represent the views of the organization for which I work or the member countries of that organization. And I'm going to talk about some specific economic work that we've been undertaking with some colleagues of mine. And I'd really like to start, though, by saying that I'm going to speak specifically about inequality. So I'm not going to be speaking of social values in general, but focused on inequality. And that's because I think there are some profound issues to address in that area. But also, I want to emphasize that well-performing markets sometimes have the potential to reduce inequality. And that can be initially a surprise as an argument or as a conclusion. And so I want to provide some body that goes behind that. And clearly, equality has been an important social value for centuries, and markets and market power have also been important and a justification for state intervention. If you go back in time to laws about regulating the crossing of bridges, I think there was a real concern with local market power that led to the creation of such laws. And when bridge owners, and bridges were privately owned, as you may recall many times, when they would charge any price they wanted, that would particularly have adverse effects on farmers and small producers who were seeking to trade and to sell their goods across the other side of the water. So I think the interest in state actions to control monopoly really goes back a long time, and in many ways, it's even at the origins of competition law in North America. If you look at the way the railroad monopolies were behaving, that was a tremendous motivator politically for the creation of competition law. So the owners of the railways were sometimes referred to as robber barons, but the reason they earned this name was because they were charging very high prices when there was no absence of railway competition to serve farmers. When there was competition, they charged much more reasonable prices. So let me start with an example of how competition can create some benefits. And I want to focus here on what's happened with Mexico mobile telephone calling in the last 5 years or so. Now, what's been very dramatic is change in regulatory attitudes that has promoted competition in mobile telephone calling. And prices in Mexico fell by between 60 and 70% over a period of 2 or 3 years. That's, I think, a finding that, that is well documented, and you could confirm with anyone you know who's Mexican. What's interesting, though, is that there are surveys of how much different income groups were spending on mobile telephony. And the results of that suggested that the poorest decile of the population, so that's represented at the far left in dark blue, was spending, before these changes in prices, around 6% of its income on mobile telephone calling. There are always questions about the accuracy of reporting of income and of spending, but this was much higher than any of the other decile groups. And the simple reduction in prices of mobile telephony, if that didn't change the consumption, would lead to an effective increase in the real income of the poor by 4%. So this is quite an enormous change coming from increased competition in one sector, and it's rather surprising. It's not necessarily replicable across sectors, but where there are sectors that are heavily consumed by the poor, competition can generate some substantial benefits. Now, at the same time, inequality is very substantial across the OECD. So this picture shows income inequality by various groups, focusing on the difference between the bottom 90% and the top 1%. There's very substantial differences. It doesn't break out what's going on for the very poor, but the very high income earners, so the top 1%, are in dark red here in terms of their share of the pie of income. And it's not quite as much as I would have thought it would be for the top 1%, but it's still disproportionate. But when you come to wealth and wealth inequality, that's much more substantial, the differences across groups. And so I'm going to talk about both of these points. And really, I want to emphasize that one of the sources of inequality may be related to market power. Market power has an interesting effect, and it's one that's been largely ignored when focusing on sources of inequality through much prior work. So market power does the following. It generates profits for the companies engaging in enjoying that market power, shall we say, above the competitive rate of return, and it raises prices to consumers, reducing their real income and their ability to save. And the bottom line is that this creation of market power can hurt the poor and those without an equity interest in profits, which is actually a very large percentage of the population. And so we're going to show some figures about that. But I just note also that Piketty, in his well-known work on inequality, is a little bit skeptical about the value that markets might provide. And so this work is something of a qualification of what he says on that front, but not his general points about increasing inequality in recent years. Now, what we've done is to produce a model, and since I didn't want this whole session to go past without any equations being shown, I do have to put these up for you. But the point is that it's a relatively simple model. And so these equations started out much more complicated, and they end up like this. And so for me, as an economist, it's beautiful. And one of the points is that market power is closely related to how wealth patterns will change for different groups. And basically, competition, implementing a more competitive environment than we have now, will raise the wealth share of households who are at the lower level of the wealth levels, and drop the wealth share of the households that are at the top levels. And this is a very natural consequence of the fact that when there's market power generating income, that is then turned into wealth that is potentially problematic when the market power itself is considered illegitimate. Now, I think it's important to point out that market power can come from legitimate sources and illegitimate sources, and there's not any convincing work that shows the extent to which market power comes from one as opposed to the other. But it is certainly true that cartels and anti-competitive activities have created some, well, have affected enormous amounts of economic activity over time. And so what we did is we estimated some markups that are above what you might think of as a minimal level for each sector, and then averaged across sectors in each country, and we found the extent to which there are excess markups in different countries. One finding that came out of this type of approach is that the United Kingdom actually has lower markups or lower excess markups on average than other countries in this study, so that in which we had 8. And the other point in this model is that marginal propensities to save are quite important, and the relationship between the marginal propensity to save and the average propensity to save. It's I guess, I hope, intuitive that the more you will save out of your income, the more there will be a contribution to building up wealth. And the truth is that the higher income part of the population has a much higher marginal propensity to save than others, and we cannot fully reflect that in the simplicity of this model, but that makes our results much, much stronger if it's followed through into a simulation. I just want to show you what the impact is of a 1% markup reduction across different income groups. And what you see is that that 1% reduction has the largest impact on the top 1% of the income earners, and then approximately no impact between the 81 and 90th percentile. But then for everyone below the 80th percentile level, there's a positive impact from these markup reductions. And that's very much the point of this Mexican work also, that reducing excess markups can really create substantial benefits, and competition is one force that can reduce those excess markups. So maybe I could just show that there's also a follow-on effect from this, if you will, on wealth. And this figure illustrates how there could be rates of change in the wealth level of the top 10% of the population if there were more competitive environment, and so if the excess were eliminated. And there's some range to this because we have uncertainty about the ratio of marginal propensity to save to average propensity to save. But one of the headline finding is that on average, excess market power could account for between 6 and 21% of the wealth of the top decile. And that those numbers could actually be almost twice as high if we take into account the true variation in marginal propensity to save between the very wealthy and the very poor, because the very poor do not save. But in our model, we do attribute some savings to them. So what are the implications of this? It's that perhaps a competition policy to control monopoly can actually lead to some reduction in the illegitimate redistribution of income and wealth towards the richest and the most powerful, and thus contribute to an environment with less inequality. It's not going to solve any concerns we might have overall, but it is, I think, an important element of the puzzle as a whole, and one that's largely been ignored in the past. And just to give you a sense of what some of the numbers might be, if we focus on wealth levels, it might very well be that up to 16 trillion US dollars in wealth in these 8 countries in our study may come from excessive market power. So I think that is a very large number, even if we think in terms of annual GDP of large countries. And so I think that there's definitely much room for further exploration of these types of points. And I'd refer you to a paper we have on SSRN that goes into the details of this. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much to the panelists for those, I suppose, thought-provoking sort of introduction to this question. So can markets pursue social values? I think very much it depends. Markets seem to be a source of exploitation of the most vulnerable, particularly if we think of the context of the labour markets in certain circumstances, but also Sean's work suggests that they're also perhaps liberating for vulnerable individuals in other circumstances. I was particularly taken with the idea of perhaps the capitalist rationale for the pursuit of socialist values was coming through in Julia's remarks. The idea that perhaps rather cynically a firm might pursue a social agenda in its business model. Which I guess brings us to the portion of the proceedings where we open to the floor for questions. So if you could perhaps mention who you are before your question to the panel. Hopefully there are some questions. Yeah.
I wonder, listening to your great views on answering the question, the purpose of the lecture, whether anyone has studied totally unregulated markets, by which I'm thinking of a criminal market or a criminal economy, and if so, does that give us any great insight into what happens when there is no intervention at all, apart from perhaps law enforcement stepping in? So I'm wondering if that is a totally organic way of people operating without any ethical or state intervention, and is that a valid thing to look at?
I hope so, because we're just launching a journal on the new LSE Press called Illicit Economies. So I hope it's valid. Don't know if this is on. Well, I'll jump in, Simon, and then you jump in. So the answer is yes. So there's been a lot of work, particularly by economic historians, sociologists of markets, economic sociologists, some by socio-legal scholars, which has looked at completely unregulated markets, which may be illicit, to look at actually the social norms by which they operate. So the Maghreb traders are particularly well studied, the diamond markets, for example, and there are also those that look at, if you were to look at the illicit economies, if you look at a drug market, basically, then you find the same dynamics occurring as you do in a market which has no legal underpinning, whether legal or illegal. Similar ones occurring. Social networks, social contacts, and the ability to have some form of enforcement mechanism, which means that your contracts will be enforced over time. So if you look at the evolution of, economics historians always go to champagne fairs at this particular juncture, but you can go to other places as well, in different markets. You know, you pay part now for delivery sometime in the future when the harvest comes in, or the champagne is ready, whatever. But whenever your drug market, etc. So you need some way of ensuring that you don't have defection, okay, in that settlement period, to put it in its technicalities. And the way that that's enforced is through social norms. And the thing that then tends to vary is how nice or how not nice are people in enforcing those social norms. So in other words, it's a version of narcos. So it comes in basically you have violence coming through. Or is it actually through the power of family connections? And in the diamond markets, for example, it's power of family connections, so that you didn't defect, because then you'd be ostracized by that entire social community. So it was those social norms very powerfully that kept those contracts in place. And so yes, there is, and it is absolutely fascinating, because you then start to see informal systems of arbitration coming out. You then start to see informal systems of dispute resolution. And one of the things that then distinguishes licit from illicit is basically the role of violence in the maintenance of those contracts and those relationships. And then you've got monopoly power You've got trying to interruption of supply chains. You've got duties being paid as things cross borders, again, licit or licit in the form of bribes or non. So it's a really interesting study on a parallel economy.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'd add that there's probably some kind of relationship between the extent of a market and the formality of the mechanisms which underpin it. So very informal markets operate on trust and social contact networks and force. And they can be extremely effective amongst small groups or people who know each other, but they're not so effective when it comes to anonymous trading. Now, in our type of society, the vast volume of trade in a country like ours is still anonymous trade, or is anonymized in a way, or it's trade through corporations, where the identity of the individual may not matter, but the perpetual identity of the corporation helps to maintain trust. So I think that studying informal markets is fine, and many sociologists and social scientists are interested in the informal. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of serious studies of the formal. It's very little studied, and sociologists like Arthur Stinchcombe, who study it, are renowned but unread by and large. And to understand the formal is to understand the way that formal markets do often tend to have a deep division of labour. They are often, therefore, better able to capture specialisation than informal markets, and that's also leaving aside violence as a mode of enforcement. Of course, the state employs violence, mediated violence, as a mode of enforcement. The state is a monopoly, has a monopoly over force, or should do, in a rule of law state and a market economy. One of the roles of the state is precisely to achieve that monopoly. So, of course, the violence hasn't completely disappeared, has it? But it's mediated in a different way. So, sure, there's been a great deal of time spent analysing the informal and lauding it, but actually the formal, which requires a rule of law state and requires an organised market economy, maybe has quite a lot to be said for it.
Question? Yeah.
Thank you. Question for Sean about inequality. You said very eloquently about how important it was to reduce market power, but it strikes me that these days multinational corporations are getting bigger and bigger. It's an increasingly globalized market, and national regulators have got less that they can do to increase competition. So what role can international bodies play to reduce monopoly power?
Yeah, I think this raises a question of, can international authorities cooperate with each other in one way or another, whether it's a strong way or a weak way. And I think there's a really strong interest in cooperating and ensuring that outcomes that are involving the same type of behavior by the same entities are treated in similar ways in different geographical jurisdictions. And certainly for cartel behavior, there's been really a lot of progress in achieving the type of common approach that one might desire, and that is sadly lacking in some of the other types of areas that might be related to abuses of dominant position or mergers in which one country feels that a merger is fine and another feels it's not, and then it's difficult to mediate between those two very basically different positions.
There's a question right at the front. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's possibly reasonable to argue that it's actually markets under capitalism is impossible. The very purpose of capitalism is, I would say, the economic rape of the people of the planet. And this would then lead to the destruction of markets by because markets would make communities richer. from the local up. So the capitalism job is to make sure that the death of market is done through monopolies, which is why we have Asda owned by Walmart, why we have train companies that are owned by internationals who don't pay tax. All this takes money, wealth, intellect, and aspirations of not only the people but of a country away from a country. That's what capitalism does. And there is no markets. All markets will be swallowed up by monopolies, by billionaires. Capitalism's job is to destroy markets, not create them, and therefore destroy the political aspirations and wealth of communities across the world. Thank you.
Okay, would anyone like to tackle that?
Okay, so So therefore, what's good, if anything, about capitalism? Okay, so Marx famously said that capitalism created inequality and exploitation and injustice, but also innovation and technological change. So there was this enormous increase in growth, yes, and destruction of the environment, which began around about 1800. So historical records appear to show that up to that point, almost everywhere, whatever part of the world we might be considering, growth is really small and is not sustained over a long period of time. Something happened around about 1700, 1800 that changed that, and that was capitalism. And of course, it creates these huge contradictions. That's right. That's what Marx also emphasized. The Fabians and others later came along to try to manage capitalism. That was clearly their agenda. And I think for most of the 20th century, people thought they had more or less succeeded.
You can't manage something you don't understand.
Well, I think, sure. Well, I think that, I think it's cyclical, that whatever success they achieved was only temporary. And since about 1980, and in particular since 2008, the financial crisis, I think it's become abundantly clear that Fabian settlement, that didn't work, but nor did the neoliberal reaction to it. So now many people would be very, very skeptical about the future of capitalism. And that's why we hear people talking about it ending. I, as a researcher, as a social scientist, if I take a purely descriptive or positive approach to this, don't see capitalism about to end. Okay, that's why I'm more concerned with managing it effectively than hurrying along its destruction. But I do recognize that it's not straightforward. No, yeah. Well, I think, okay, I put my cards on the table. I'm a big critic of capitalism, but I don't believe that capitalism can only be managed in a way that creates poverty. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come to this? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, we've got a hand right at the back there.
I've got a question for Simon. You said that Beveridge was being quite utopian, but didn't want to search for a utopia when he was first creating the reforms and trying to find a way to control capitalism, as you just said. But do you think it's still utopian to try and find a market that pursues all social values and not just inequality and fair trade?
No, I don't think the search for some reconciliation between market principles and fairness principles is utopian. I think it's something which is worked out all the time in lots of areas of regulation in some sort of incremental way based upon learning and often trial and error, rather than there being one fundamental transformation that may take place within society or one fundamental idea that will reform our capitalism. So I think I take from Beveridge a determination as a social scientist to analyze things at a micro level, to get data on many questions on which there are no data at all. I also take from Beveridge the importance of designing institutions to be incentive compatible, right? So I think Beveridge's social insurance plan was largely incentive compatible. You may say that's, in a way, accepting too much the point of view of the propertied or the wealthy. But at the end of the day, regulation must appeal to them as well. It's rather like the analogy with contagion. When the stench of the River Thames grew so great for the MPs that they had to pass a law to try and deal with cholera, that's when even the propertied and wealthy, yes, began to see that regulation might be in their interests too. We very much hope in our type of society that it isn't necessary to have that sort of situation before we regulate to avoid the turbulences which arise from inequality. We'd like to have regulation of inequality before we have a fundamental crisis. I gave a talk at the LSE about 25 years ago about labour market regulation and argued that what the Webbs had done could again be done for our own time. And a colleague said, what you really want to see happen is 2 world wars and a Great Depression. After all that, you would finally get the welfare state. At that stage, I thought that's far too pessimistic. But of course, we've had a fundamental financial crisis, haven't we? And very little has changed. So I appreciate the enormous difficulty of shifting the political and indeed academic consensus around these issues. In the social sciences, the financial crisis has changed the academic understanding of these issues remarkably little. And it took the Webbs and Beveridge decades to achieve what they did, and a comparatively short space of time in the 1980s and 90s for that to be unraveled. So yeah, I don't see this being a utopian vision. I just think of it as a very slow, incremental, and in many ways unglamorous process, I'm afraid.
So question again at the front, yeah.
Following on from that, and also from the comment at the end, that kind of represents 2 ends of the spectrum in terms of capitalism and markets and values. I wondered what the panel would think about merging markets and values, in the sense that at the moment, capitalism and markets are driven by making money. And if you're in a position of being a CEO of an organisation, your goal is to make as much money as possible and have it provide as big a return for your shareholders. And you might have a lifespan in that role of, say, 4 years, and you might be making huge profits every year. Now, what would happen if we were able to kind of shift society so money wasn't the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal was something of social value, like how much you contribute to charity or to childcare or education, and not just pure profit. Or is that a naive wish?
So no, it's not a naive. No, it's not. Well, it may be a naive wish in the sense that we haven't got there yet, but that doesn't mean we can't keep working for it. And I think where that comes to is to looking at and this is where the debate has always been around, how the management or the regulation of capitalism, regulatory capitalism, but it's also is looking at the constituent components of capitalism. So part of that goes to the core constituent component of the corporation, which goes into corporate governance, which goes into the long-standing debate about the different nature of corporate governance, the role of directors' duties, should it be legally enshrined in that? The motivation is absolutely for shareholder profit. Should that have the sort of German model? Should you try and incorporate those social values into absolutely the heart of the decision-making, right into, as it were, the nerve centre of the way that the corporation works as a core component and constituent of capitalism? So that's where that debate takes place. It takes place in another constituent part of capitalism, which is labour laws. So this is absolutely in Simon's territory and echoes what he was saying back 25 years ago about the structuring of those labour laws. If you also then look at, for example, pensions is another really interesting area where you have a lot of risk shifting going. So you had quite an interesting settlement coming through in the defined benefit scheme of pensions, whereby it was the employer that was taking that risk to provide those benefits, post-work benefits for their employees. Very strong, socially, legally facilitated system and only latterly regulated system of actually capitalist provision, as it were, of social insurance for their workers, so that you didn't have the state to do that. What you've had there is obviously a change completely and reversal in that risk arrangement, which then puts more onus on the individual to manage their own financial risk, and then falls that back on in terms of the role of the safety net of the state. So what you have is it's changing that implicit bargain, as it were, between the state safety net and what it is that those capitalist institutions should themselves be providing, whether it's both directly in terms of the financial provision that they should be providing for their workers, in terms of security, in terms of all those other add-ons that I was talking about. And I think, and then so that you minimise the role of the state to have to do that. So you could go, right back to Lord Leverhulme and Port Sunlight and that entire wraparound, as it were, of that particular model of the corporation, or very much the Unilever type model as well. So it's not utopian to think about that. It's just really painful hard work, because these debates have been going on for decades, and it's inching that progress through. So why not? That comes to power, that comes to usual politics, etc. But it is about that, finding that interface so that you get right into the constituent components of capitalism to try and open them up to a different and wider set of values.
Yeah, I think there are some things that would definitely shouldn't be marketized, even in a capitalist economy, for that economy to function. One is the state. We tend to talk about the rule of law and justice on the whole in terms which are not amenable to buying and selling it. And I think that the gap between, or the boundary between the market and the state has become too porous. So market values flow into the state, private values of accumulation, and they are deforming and corroding our state from within. And they're ultimately going to corrode the rule of law, because we can't maintain law's autonomy from these processes. That's the threat. And the justification for doing that is an intellectual one from some social scientists who would reduce even what government does to some version of the market. Chicago School price theory, the Virginia School public choice theory, law and economics in one version. That's a fantastically dangerous idea. Corruption in its forms is little more than the invasion of the public sector by the private. So a failure to maintain a public-private divide constitutionally and institutionally is a fantastically dangerous step. And that's where we are, I think, in a society like ours, which has experienced 30 or 40 years or so of so-called neoliberal policy making, seeing the state in such instrumental terms, marketizing the state, and of course, the health system, the education system, and so forth. I was struck thinking about Sean's presentation on Mexican telephony. What happened if we applied this logic to the school system? One way to protect the poor, it seems to me, is not to privatize our schools. But there's really nothing inherent in our education system that makes it unprivatizable. Right? And indeed, it's a plan for many people. Maybe telephony should be the same. It should be in the hands of the state.
Well, telephony was in the hands of the state for a long time, and it didn't advance very well in the hands of the state. So I think there are some reasons to have this private sector influence. In countries like Mexico, when you wanted a new telephone line in the world where it was run by the state, you would have to wait for months, and that sped up when it was privatized slightly. But when there was competition from others to provide the object, some type of distant telecommunication services, that's when quality improved for people. So I think I wouldn't choose telecom as the area that should be state-run, but I'm not mentioning the other sectors you talked about.
I think just if I may, I'll just have a second bite of this. To my mind, one of the real dangers is, just to add on to these comments here, is the misconception of markets, which is then taken and applied to a public service. So we see this in the health system. We see this at the moment in the current debate about university education and what the nature of a student and the distinction between a student and a consumer, and the marketization and financialization of both of those systems. And I think it's, the idea that you can take one model of the market that might operate completely purely in the private sector and you impose exactly the same model within a public government-run market in which government has a strong role and there are very strong social values at play there, then you have a complete misplant. In technical terms, I think the National Audit Office has now started recognising this, actually, and saying, well, actually, there are different types of markets with different types of consumers within them, and that what you need is that in terms of managing those, you can't just take a transplant from utilities market and say, well, actually, universities are going to work exactly the same way, which is current kind of government policy.
Just to pick up on that point, I'm sure Sean's right about innovation, and we spoke earlier about Marx even saying that capitalism is needed for innovation. I think these things go in cycles, and there comes a moment when the state can feasibly nationalise areas of industry which have stopped innovating much. After all, it did that with industries like coal which were privately founded and used the 19th century equivalent of venture capital, the same with the railways, in capitalism's early period. At a later period, many of these firms were bankrupt. These companies were nationalized and then again were privatized. So I think it's cyclical. I just wonder whether we have a good theory of why we may be happy to privatize telephony, but not very happy, I would think, to privatize our school system. There's clearly a sense in which if everything in the school system were privatized, we'd see a whole lot of innovation. I think that's undoubtedly the case. And that's the spirit behind the free school movement. Of course, there is also, at the same time, the production of some extremely negative externalities, one of which will be, in the end, a waste of taxpayer money, almost certainly a distortion of spending decisions, and probably a lot of kids not getting educated. But whether in economic welfare terms, the gains to the winners from that outweigh the losers is a question an economist might pose. But I think a Democrat would want to insist on children getting and having a right to the same level of high quality education. And that I don't think could be provided by the market.
Any further questions? Yep, hand here.
So I feel like there's a lot of enthusiasm at the moment around areas like green finance, social impact investing, and they seem to function largely by leveraging popular sentiment to almost distort markets, so almost to invert the question and have social values pursue markets, sort of chase them down and twist their arm a bit to focus investment in certain areas. To what extent do you think this actually represents a real fundamental change in how we're doing business, and to what extent is it maybe slightly cynical greenwashing by asset managers and banks?
I tend to go for cynicism over optimism most times, actually. So yeah, no doubt there are some, and there are not all moves towards sustainable production and modes of production are greenwashing, but I think it's marginal. It's at the margins. It's not at the core. And I think, to be honest, when you have somebody like Sheryl Sandberg stand up and say, oh, Facebook is not about making profits, when she's got £1 billion, well, obviously slightly less now, worth in stock, I think you just have to really question, actually, motives.
Yeah, I think that, I'm now going to defend Milton Friedman. Okay, I've defended Marx, Milton Friedman. When Milton Friedman said the job of a corporation is to make a profit, and a company is well run if it's profitable, it's not well run if it's trying to do good things. Okay, his basic point was, on the one hand, here are corporations, they function well when they're profit-seeking organizations, but on the other hand, there is regulation, there is law. The other side of Friedman's article, less mentioned, even by Chicago school people, is law is created by the public system, by the state, not by companies always regulating themselves. Accepting what Julia said earlier, I've also studied this and would have argued, yes, for self-regulation, and I'm sure I've written a couple of pieces about CSR, saying it can work, but ultimately, regulation of companies should be by the state, I think, not companies regulating themselves, partly because they are set up, yes, exactly, to be as profitable as they can be. So the Economist model of the maximizing agent, I don't think we now believe well describes a human person, does it? This is a behavioral revolution in economics. But it very well describes the corporate form. Somehow we've created a rather unnatural institutional device which embeds the notion of profit maximization, not just in our economy, but increasingly in our public life as well. That's a huge problem. So, of course, if we had effective laws and regulation, partly they would work by nudging. Okay, so I'm not saying that companies shouldn't attempt to reconcile environmental sustainability as far as they can with profit making, but that's really not what they are there to do. So I think there's a need for strong public regulation alongside these occasionally interesting, but in the end rather, I think, unsatisfying arguments about green and environmental social responsibility.
Yeah, I like your thoughts on cyclicality, Simon, and so I think that it is one of the advantages of having a profit focus is that the numbers are clear. The numbers are clear, and then having more of the focus for companies on social values actually becomes difficult to implement. Not only because there are multiple objectives, but because the non-profit objectives, I think, are much more difficult to measure in general. And so there's a measurement problem, and maybe it's better for somebody else to push companies towards these less measurable goals than to have the companies internalize that, because it will be very difficult for them to do so in a reasonable way.
Yeah, there are these metrics and indicators, aren't there? There are whole consultancies and businesses that will sell you a set of social and green metrics. And that, of course, itself also is a private sector business, and one which has thrived. And it is fascinating to study it. But in the end, perhaps the results aren't altogether convincing. I think, though, I still want to defend the idea that the company, if it's run in a balanced way, wouldn't just have the objective of satisfying the shareholder interest. Okay, I think companies, when they're profitable, are also inevitably returning value to employees and to communities through taxation. Really, our system of taxation depends on what companies do at the end of the day. And I don't just mean corporate tax, but income tax is, in a way, a tax on the company. The individual pays it, but it's really taxing a type of corporate activity. Without that form of revenue generation, our states in their current form wouldn't function. So I think there's a strong symbiotic relationship between the way companies operate, and in a capitalist market economy, they do need to be profitable to generate a surplus. They absolutely do. And the welfare state captured part of that surplus for state education, health, and these other things that we collectively benefit from. So of course, yes, indeed, it makes it very difficult to undermine and destabilize capitalism if you see it that way, because it's highly imbricated with our modern social democracies. These are genuine dilemmas. Of course, when the corporation is disembedded from that process, when we have the use of the corporate form to evade tax on the scale that we're now familiar with, thanks to the Panama Papers and so forth, that is a serious problem. Because then if the company isn't at all contributing to the sustainability of governmental systems, there seems really to be very little justification for preserving it as a legal and social form.
Got a question here?
Don't we have a fundamental problem in that capitalism is like a juggernaut? You know, its capital is growing at a compound rate, and it constantly needs to find places in order to invest. So it's moving into areas that were around social value. I'm thinking about social care, etc., where you know, maybe what's required is actually more labour to actually be available to support social services. And yet, you know, with its attempt to create innovation and profit, you're seeing, you know, technology going in there, maybe presenting a future which might not be so great. So that might be one issue. And it's also sort of going into areas of politics as well, in the sense that it's buying politicians. You know, America, witness Trump, etc. So I'd just like to, I don't know if that's a problem that we can address or that the state can address, but I'd like the panel to address it.
Any ideas?
Okay, well, I think you're right, you know, because if you have a sector where there are few profit-making activity, opportunities in that sense, okay, social care is a good example. It's not about to be revolutionized by technology, or if it is, we don't yet understand how. It's very labor-intensive, and it's delivering a service person to person, human to human. If you privatize that sector, if you outsource it, in the end, those companies can only really be profitable in the way that capitalism requires them to be by battening down the wages, which they've done, and reducing the quality of the service to customers. That's right. So there are some sectors where this model undoubtedly will have that effect. There are other sectors which require probably some dynamic of capitalism in order to produce the type of technological innovation we've got. People say to me, you argue for high wages and a high labour cost in order to give firms incentives to replace labour with capital. So workers lose their jobs because firms become more efficient. Yeah, this has always happened within capitalism, but of course, at the same time, that labour is released for other purposes. That's why so many people are employed in the health service or education service of an economy like ours. There are many, many opportunities. I think in future there will be for human beings to work. So yeah, it's a mixed economy. If you make the whole thing about profit maximization, I agree with you. You've got a fundamental problem because you write about the tendency of capitalism to seek out the very highest rate of return and to compound it and to carry on until everything has been exhausted.
But for me, it comes also, if you look at, I think one of the interesting things that economists are starting to move into look at is not to look at welfare growth in the aggregate, but to actually realise that actually distributional effects are really the things that need to be taken account of. So the fact that overall figures, you know, you've got overall growth, etc., that actually has to move into looking at those distributional effects. I think looking at the social care system is interesting because what bites there is actually, yeah, you can have a very effective private market for social care, but it would not achieve the social value of enabling those who cannot afford the provision that the market is providing at the prices which are necessary for it to charge in order to ensure that you have highly paid labour, would mean that a number of people are then priced out of the market. So I think that's a very good illustration of the juxtaposition and the conflict, as it were, between a social value, which is to ensure that everybody has a certain minimum level of social care, notwithstanding their need and their ability to pay, and the recognition that the market is necessarily going to produce that good at that price, given the actual ability to pay rather than a willingness to pay. Economists often look at things on the basis of a willingness to pay model and identify, okay, well, the price is there because that illustrates people's willingness to pay rather than their ability to pay. So, and that's where that nexus comes in. And that's where you have that. That's a kind of bleeding edge, and unfortunately, quite literally, of that clash that we have now, because historically we focused on the NHS as our universal care provision, which we did through one type of infrastructure, through our governance infrastructure, through trusts, etc. Whereas our social care system, as we know, is at the local authority level, not the central government level. So you have a different level, scale, as it were, of government organisation going through. And we had a national health system put in place, but not a national social care system, which was reliant, originally coming up through the parishes. You still got traces of poor law, etc., coming up through there. You've got traces of previous regulatory regimes going past centuries, actually, within the UK system as we currently have it. And that's where you have that very hard edge right now.
Just one quick thought on the point about the extending search of capital activity. When toll roads are privatized, this is quite an interesting phenomenon because you cannot expect there to be large increases in efficiency from private operation of toll roads, I think. But the private operator has to recover a much higher return on capital than the state operator. And that means ultimately that prices have to go up and all the consumers on the toll road have to pay higher prices because of the privatization. The state may receive a one-off gain, but the consumers ultimately will be worse off. And so I think that there is a delicate balance to be made as to what type of activity should be a state activity and what type may be appropriate for privatization.
We probably have time for one final question if there's one in the room. Okay, there's not. I will just say thank you. Oh, there is was there a hand? No. Okay. Oh, okay, there is one here. Sorry. Thank you.
So I was just going to go back to your point about how companies can't pursue green objectives if their reason to exist is to pursue the profit motive. Can capitalism ever pursue social values if capitalism is a system that's built on extracting natural resources, and a social value is to live in a world that can sustain us? And so if you follow those two things, surely they're just diametrically opposed.
okay, not all of capitalism is based on the extraction of natural resources. If you're thinking about sustainable development and clean energy and growth of different modes of that, I think so. But moving away from that particular technicality and back to the motivations, and can you ever divert a company away from a profit motive? I think one has to then look at the sort of the market infrastructure in which that company is operating, and therefore the incentives that it is being put upon it. And those incentives come not just from its shareholders, actually, but from those who are seeking to invest in it. And then we now get into the asset markets and the financial markets and the issues about short-termism in those markets and the needs for, ever increasing proof that as an asset manager you are demonstrating that your funds are growing on a quarterly basis. Well, as an asset manager, your contracts and your trust contracts and that you're committed to in relation to your beneficiaries, who might be the individuals of you and I, actually, and sitting in those pension schemes which are now bearing all that risk. If your trustees of our money have said to the asset managers, you need to demonstrate that you've got very good performance on these investments and you need to demonstrate that to me in every quarter, then the asset managers will be saying to the companies, well, I need to be demonstrating that my share prices are going up every quarter. Can you please ensure that? Companies, directors are then incentivized through their pay packets to make sure to manage the principal agent problem for the shareholders, that yes, that they are incentivized to ensure that those profits go up on that very short-term basis. And so you have, it's not just, it is context matters. That is the big issue, that is the big sort of cry, as it were, of all behaviouralists and all of those and all institutionalists, which is context absolutely matters. So you have to look at the wider institutional context in which those things are nested, but then realise the loops that come back, as I say, is back to the yous and I's, whose money, savings, pensions are being invested in those very same markets. So you have to see how that cycle operates, and therefore to see, well, how do you get the breaks in that? How do you get the management of that? How do you look at not only each individual component part, as I was talking about earlier, but how do you look at the system and those system interlinkages? And that's a really wicked problem.
Any final thoughts? Okay, that's probably a very thought-provoking point at which to end. Thank you so much to the panellists for these. It's such a difficult and ambitious question, and I think we've got some really interesting and I like to think of positive answers, maybe not just cynical answers, but some very positive answers as well. So, final thank you.